Good evening, everyone. I'm Samradhi Sharma, a first year Calvin at JCRC University, and I'm excited to host today's Tech Talk. Thank you all for being here. We are joined today by Agriya Khetapal, who is a software engineer at Quantsite and has also been an active contributor in scientific Python ecosystem. He has worked on impactful projects like Pyodide, Jupyterlite, and more, which is making Python more accessible and through browser, also through Beyond. He also brings deep insight into open source contributions and licensing. So let's start today's session, which has topic the open source iceberg, licenses, livelihoods, and leadership. Explores what lies beneath the surface of open source from contributions and licensing to careers and digital infrastructure. Let's all give Agdir a warm welcome with an emoji shower, please. Uh, Thank you, everyone. So, without any further ado, I would like to invite Agdir to take us through the session. Over to you, Agdir.
Hi all, am I audible? Sure, thanks. And thanks for the
Yes.
warm welcome. I'll take a moment to set up my slides and share my screen. But otherwise, thanks for taking the time to join. Are my slides visible to everyone? Thanks. So, hi all, this is a presentation on this topic that I compiled called the open source iceberg. And I'll be talking about these things today: licenses, livelihoods, leadership. And I also have the slides. If you want to follow along with the presentation, you can use this QR code. So I won't uh, restrict you with this. I can use this to, um, well, you can just use this to follow along with the slides, and you don't need to wait for me to explain a few concepts. But it's of course helpful if you follow along with my presentation with the slides. Yep, I would like to start abruptly and mention that the open source world right now is analogous to an iceberg. And what I mean by this is that there's there's two sections to an iceberg, right? There's one section that's above the water. That's usually perceived by people as what the iceberg is actually is, and there's the other part of the iceberg, let's say constituting about 90% of the rest of the iceberg, that's below water and you don't necessarily see it. So similarly, open source has a few concepts. You have contributions, you have things like documentation, visible PRs, contributing to open source projects. But below the water, you don't see a lot of other things. For example, maintainer burden. People who are maintainers of these projects facing burdens. Open source program offices, licensing, funding mechanisms, legal frameworks, sponsorship, and so on. And this is something that I will be touching on in my presentation in the coming slides. So besides that, there are a bunch of open source entry points. As you might know, I'm not here to talk about a lot of open source programs that you might know: Google Summer of Code, Outreachy, Code for GovTech. I mean, these are all programs that you would already know from other presentations. So this is not my goal with this presentation. You can use other blogs and resources to find out about these. And then there's also about um, making sure that your GitHub profile is green, which doesn't make sense a lot. Then there's this Hacktoberfest event where you have a 1 month event to contribute to open source, and you usually use to get recognition and appreciation for it. Then there's also scientific research. So people who contribute to science, they use open source software as a part of their research, and then this is also something that drives them to contribute to it. Similarly, governments and open source program offices, which we will discuss later in this presentation, also have a vested interest in open source. So there are multiple stakeholders and multiple entry points to open source, and uh, from various different fields and various levels of experience. So there are a bunch of ways to contribute to open source. Many of these are things that you might already know. Writing pull requests for features, bug fixes, writing tutorials, even let's say creating tutorials for YouTube tutorials for a particular library or a package is also considered as contributing to open source, because you are indirectly helping other people use that software. Similarly, triaging issues and maintaining repositories. So doing administrative work basically. And then there's UI UX design. Open source projects need to be marketed. So you need designs and graphics, you need websites for them, you need great landing pages, you need logos, and so many other things. And then because open source is not necessarily accessible to um, people who use English as a second language, then you have translations. So you have things like translation workflows where you help automate translations. So you can have community contributors write translations and localizations for you for different languages. Similarly, there's community outreach, because you have an open source project, you have to market it, and you have to ensure that there's a community of the community that uses that open source project has a way to, let's say, talk to the maintainers, talk to other contributors, and things like those. And then there's grant writing, funding support, so ensuring that open source software is sustained, and financial donations. So if you don't do the rest of these things, then you can contribute to open source projects directly by paying their maintainers, or let's say the organizations that manage them. So here's a little bit about me. I'll be quick. I have a background in computer science and applied math. I graduated last year in August, but I have been working as a software engineer at Quantsite since before I graduated, basically. And I have been privileged to contribute to the scientific Python ecosystem and also help maintain the Biodide ecosystem. You might also know me for my other work on Jupyter Lite. It's a serverless distribution of Jupyter. AutoCRAD. AutoCRAD is uh, an open source framework for the automatic differentiation of Python and NumPy code. And similarly, for other work on numerical projects like Python battery mathematical modeling. So I contributed to PyBAM as a part of the Google Summer of Code program, but I have been involved in the community since then. And I have a bunch of interests if you're interested in looking at these. So as a maintainer in the open source world, I wear multiple hats. So not only do I do code contributions by means of features, bug fixes, issue triage, but also I manage our social media communities, social media pages and communities. So I manage our mailing list on the python.org um, central mailing list. There's a sub mailing list for Biodide. I also manage the social media pages, and I participate in design and architecture discussions with senior maintainers who are more knowledgeable than I am. So, as one person, as a maintainer, I wear multiple hats. So you never do the same thing every day, and that is the essence of open source. It's always new. It has something fresh to offer. So right now I have this small slide to show what I do usually. So this is Python kernel powered by Biodide, and it's running with WebAssembly. And WebAssembly allows you to run this, um, basically run this any code that you want inside a REPL. Inside, let's say this is right now running inside my own slides. So if I were to try it out, it should most likely run. And yeah, you can see that matplotlib ran here. I basically plotted a sigmoid function right now. And This is all running through the power of JupyterLite, which provides a kernel for PyDI. So it's all running inside your own browser, inside your own basically browser's computational resources. So it's not using a server. It's not using. You don't necessarily need to like orchestrate a server to do this. You can use your browser's computational resources to handle this, and you can try it out on the JupyterLite website. It should be the first result on Google search. So with this, I would like to pivot to this other topic about open source versus open source. There is a bit of nuance to this. So open source with the hyphen means that the source is open, whereas open source is a collective term for basically anything in the open. So it's not necessarily related to open source code, but also basically anything else. Let's say hardware. So open source hardware means hardware for which the source is available. Similarly, if you use open source without the hyphen, that means that you're talking about open source in general, so as I am in this presentation. So this is something that has a bit of and a linguistics angle to this. And there's also a nice blog post. So this is, of course, this is only an opinion. This is not, there's no right or wrong way to talk about open source. It's just an opinion by the Open Source Initiative. And it came from the evolution of language and technology in this in this century, basically. So I would like to pivot to talk about the Open Source Initiative. So this organization was founded in 1998, and it acts as the definition steward for basically whatever constitutes open source. And they sprung up with a bit of controversy in 2025 because of the open source AI definition that they raised, which is something that a lot of stakeholders disagree with, and some of them also agree with based on their vested interests. So let's move on to talking about licenses and open source because I raised that topic right now. So let's talk about Redis. So Redis was an in-memory database. It is still an in-memory database. In March 2024, they started restricting their license. They switched from a BSD license, which is a very permissive code license, to a restrictive license. And the community switched to public folks because of it. So Valkey was founded, DiceDB was founded, so many other projects were founded. And then recently, just a month or 2 months ago, they have returned with an open source license, the AGPL. So it has 3 licenses now, and it is open source again. And basically what happened was that Redis's user base was kind of shrunk by a fair bit because of their needs. Similarly, there's this company called HashiCorp. They were the creators of this open source DevOps tool called Terraform, and the fact that they started taking over control of its community and making it closed source led to the formation of the OpenTofu project. And they easily gained a lot of GitHub stars. They had a bunch of traffic, increase in traffic, and now OpenTofu was adopted as a Linux Foundation project. So this is a lesson that community can win. Open source is and should not be basically should not be well controlled by big tech organizations, because the community will try to find out ways to well overtake you and act in let's say the interests of the community itself rather than corporate interests. Similarly, the Llama license for Meta's Llama family of models, language models, has a clause, and you can read it on the website. You can go to the Meta's Llama 3 community license agreement, and it has this clause where it says that if the monthly active users of a product or a service for let's say some others service that's outside of Meta has greater than 700 million monthly active users, then you have to request a license from Meta. And this is obviously a target for other companies or competitors of Meta. And the open source initiative mentioned that this is not open source because of this clause. So you can read the blog to know more about it, but I will spare you the details. It's basically that open source should not have community control. Similarly, open source language models are the talk of the town nowadays, and open source language models are not really open source. So I'm answering the question that I have in my title. Open source models mean that you have the full source code for the model, but open weights models means that you have, let's say, you don't have, let's say that either you have the full source code or you do only have model weights. So open weights models are basically what open source models are nowadays called, and there are very rare examples of open source models where you also have the training data. So the idea is that open source models are worthless without their training data. A model is useless without its training data because you can you can never scourge through the data to find out what it's actually constituted about, what the model is going to perform like, because it's a black box. You don't know what the model data is like if you don't have the data, the data, training data that was used to train the model. So yeah, there's a difference between source available and open source. So the course code is still visible, but you can't use that. You can use that. So let's say that code. Let's say if a piece of software has its code, but it has serious restrictions on how they can use it and methods for, well, enforcing those restrictions through courts, then it is not necessarily open source. It's just source available. So you still have to buy a license from the company that distributes that software to be able to use it. So the open source initiative ruled that Meta's AI models are not open source because they restrict commercial freedom. So let's talk about a little bit about open source funding. So right now, organizations invest $7.7 billion in software annually, but not a lot of this goes to open source software, and especially maintainers of those open source software and the people who administrate those projects. So 40% of maintainers right now get $0. So they get nothing for the work that they do, and companies are using their work, they're not giving back. And a lot of maintainers have considered quitting the open source world. So many people have done that in the Linux kernel world. At one point, maintainer populations are aging. Not a lot of new people are coming to the world of open source to change those demographics. This leads to security vulnerabilities and also causes burnout, as seen by the XZ attack recently, not too long ago. So there was this initiative that was started recently called the Open Source Pledge. And the Open Source Pledge is basically a mechanism for companies to pay out uh, money to the projects that they use, or sponsor a developer who's working on open source projects, and pay them a minimum amount annually. And there are three examples here. I chose Zerodha as one of the examples because it's an Indian company. It's headquartered in India, and they are right now contributing $239,000, basically $7,000 or something for 33 employees as a fair share to open source projects. And this is their pledge to support the world of open source and its maintainers. And the goal is to help and ensure that maintainers are compensated in a manner that is sustainable to not only open source software, but also the companies, because they rely on those software. So besides that, there has also been a rise in global funding initiatives. So GitHub has a secure open source software fund. It has a focus on security and training. Sovereign Tech agency is a German digital public infrastructure fund. It has a focus on critical infrastructure, so things like compilers and things like, let's say, security projects. Zeroth has started out a new fund called the Free and Libre Open Source Software Fund, FLOSS. Open Teams has a repos initiative. It has a variable amount. It has community-driven projects, so not corporate projects. Similarly, Open Collective is an organization that orchestrates all of the payment portals and funding for various projects. And you can, if you have an open source project, you can sign up and you can use Open Collective to um, collect money from donators and sponsors of your project. Similarly, Python Software Foundation does it for the Python ecosystem. And there are many more initiatives, but we are not going to get into those in this talk. So besides that, India also has its own open source initiatives. By India, I mean the Indian government, not companies in India or corporates in India. So I specifically mean the Indian administration. So India tries to, well, promote open source software. They do it. I won't say the policy implementation is correct. It's up to the mark or something, but it's a work in progress. Right now, India has a bunch of open source projects. Right now, they also have this FOSS4Gov Innovation Challenge that you should check out. They have the CDAC, the Center for Development of Advanced Computing, also has this project called Boss Linux. It's used in some government offices. BOSS stands for Bharat Open Source Software Solutions. So it's a localized government operating system. It's a Linux flavor, Linux distribution, changed and modified for open source software and for use in governments. India does have a lot of policies on open source software. So this is a bulletin that was released by the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and they put it out in the February of 2024, so last year. And it's an 8-page document, so you can read it and try to understand what it says. But the gist is that they are trying to promote open source software and as a means to reduce costs and also empower India's digital public infrastructure. Similarly, this is something that I recently found out about. It's called OpenForge. So I saw that a bunch of digital public infrastructure projects in India right now are trying to orchestrate this new initiative called collaborative governance, where they're allowing people from outside governments, outside government employees and everything. They're allowing students, they're allowing working professionals to contribute to those open source software pieces of software. And they have a bunch of active projects from accessibility to AI focused dashboards and so on. And this is something that I think everyone should check out. I really thought it's a good initiative. I am not sure about the implementation, whether it's going well or not. That's something to be discussed. So this is a means for like enabling collaborations between the government and those software community, and especially being able for people who want to contribute to government related projects to advance India's development without having to be a government employee to do so. There are a bunch of new initiatives as well in the data protection space. So right now there's this Data Protection Act. It has been in the works for the last 6 years now. It is still taking shape. And in 2025, they have a bunch of requirements for data vendors and data brokers, especially people who are working on, let's say, backends for software, where you handle critical personal data for your users or your consumers. And there are new rules which create open source opportunities, let's say for privacy preserving frameworks or for maintaining transparency between data flows. And here, this is a way where you can contribute. I won't say it's something that you can directly, let's say, create an open source project for, but this is something that you could use as a means to advocate for usage of open source software. So it is open source software is transparent by design because all of the code is open for studying, for auditing, for learning, and for distributing. And that means that you can use this as as a framework to think about government focused open source projects and how you can perhaps think about the intersection of technology and society in India. So I will switch to the last section of my talk about open source program offices. So if you don't know what these are, so they are basically departments at various places. So there are departments at corporate community companies, at academic institutions, at government institutions, and they serve a bunch of functions. So, for example, not written here, but for example, Google has an open source program office, and basically they are the people who manage the Google Summer of Code and previously managed the Google Season of Docs programs. So the team that works on open source advocacy, open source software, the legal side of open source software, on the licensing of open source software, they are what constitute open source program offices. And basically every company usually has one. They are the ones who manage funding, and they manage things like, let's say, if there's a maintainer for an open source software project outside of let's say their community or their of their employees, then how do you pay them? Then how do you ensure that the projects that you have are community centric and not corporate centric? This is basically their goal. So there are a bunch of organizations that do this. India has CDAC, which is sort of a quasi open source program office, and they have a bunch of functions for which I have stated previously. So there have been a bunch of success stories for open source program offices. It's still a new phenomenon since, let's say, the past 15 years. So it's not, well, 15 years is a long time, but not, it's still new in the age of computers, right? So right now, there's even an international open source program office by the United Nations. And they have this collaboration between open source program offices. They organize a very large conference, which I think you should all check out. They have a bunch of interesting content. So open source has various fields that you can contribute to. You don't necessarily have to be a software engineer to contribute to open source. You can be anything, any of these fields. There's the policy side of open source, where you regulate technology and its policy in policy implementations across, let's say, a country or a corporate enterprise. Community projects, you have legal and compliance issues, you have a lot of things to think about. These are things that you can um, try out. You can see if something like this works out for you. It's not necessarily a straight path to getting there, but there are multiple resources available online for all of these things. Similarly, there are other fields like content and education. So if you don't want to, let's say, write code all day, then you can be a documentation lead. You can write docs. You can be a technical writer. You can organize trainings. You can conduct workshops for open source software. So there's a bunch of um, job opportunities that you can have in open source. So you are not restricted to, let's say, being a software engineer alone. So this is an amalgamation of all my um, learnings in open source so far, and these are the takeaways that I would share with you. There are a bunch of depths to open source that I have tried to briefly explain. I know that this is not something that um, can be covered with one presentation alone, but there are things that I hope I have left for you to ponder about. Then I also talked about a little bit about licensing. So about AI licensing, for example, it's a new hot topic right now. Given the fact that the open source AI definition is not enough, they consider open weights models as open source, while we know that that's not the case. Then India also is not lagging behind open source software policy. So you should take a look at what India is doing. All of the documents that I've shared are online. Similarly, there are multiple career opportunities, and there are different ways of funding for maintainers and contributors to open source software, which some of which you already know about, but there are also funds that do it for, let's say, senior people at open source projects. And you should take a look at those, because if you were to start an open source project of your own, then that helps. You can use funds to make sure that your open source software project is sustained as it keeps developing over the next, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years. There are a bunch of resources. You can start today. I shared open source pledge. You can read about open source program offices. You can read about OpenForge. It's an Indian government initiative. And then the open source initiative has its own definition and means to talk about licenses, which I am not a lawyer, so I cannot comment on licenses necessarily, but they have a bunch of resources that you should check out if you're interested in this side of open source. So that was basically it. Thanks for your time and thanks for listening. I'm happy to have any questions. I know that this presentation is sort of could sort of feel vague. It's a little different to conventional contributing to open source presentations. So I think this was the idea. Please let me know if you have any feedback. If you feel that this was boring, if you feel that this was insightful, please feel free to find me on any of these platforms. And if you want, here's the QR code for the slides again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Agir. Actually, we have got a question during your PPT. Somebody was asking, what is BSD licenses? Can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. So the BSD license, it's a family of free and open source software licenses developed at Berkeley. So at the University of California, Berkeley. And there are multiple licenses. So there's the BSD1 license, there's a BSD2 clause license, and 3 clause BSD license. And basically, I will read it out from the open source initiative, or maybe I can share my screen to show that. But I can, there you go. So the 3 clause BSD license is the most common out of these. And basically what it says in this short text is that the source code that you distribute, let's say if you use a particular piece of a particular code snippet from another project in your project, then you must have this license in that for that project. So if it should be inside the executables that you distribute with your project, or it should be inside the source code for your project. As let's say in a separate licenses folder, you can copy this license directly as is, or well, you have to basically it says that you have to reproduce the above copyright notice. So this copyright notice has to be it has to be displayed if you were to use this license. So it gives you this sense of security. So if you were to use this license and you can another project uses your code, then they have to comply with your license. So it grants you some level of protection against let's say plagiarism, for example.
So we'll now open the floor for questions, everybody. The Q&A section is already open. Please feel free to drop any questions of yours in that. Actually, we have got already few questions. Somebody's asking, somewhere I've seen the word triad. Could you please explain about it?
Sorry, could you repeat the
Somewhere
last?
I have seen the word triad, I guess, TRIAGE, triad. Could you
Oh,
please
sure.
explain about it?
Sure. So that word is actually triage. It's pronounced as so it's like pronounced similarly to espionage or a mirage, for example. And triage basically means organization, or let's say prioritization. So, for example, if there's a bug or let's say an issue in an open source software project, and you think that this is a high priority issue and you have to handle it because let's say it's a security concern, or let's say it's something that breaks a lot of uh, projects downstream, it breaks code for other people, then it is the responsibility of the maintainers to essentially triage that issue and mark it as high priority, so that people who are interested in contributing, or the maintainers themselves, they can take it up at a priority. And let's say if there's something that's a, let's say it's a minor bug, it's something that's let's say it's a broken link inside your documentation, that's something that should not be considered at a priority because it's just a broken link. So it doesn't affect a lot of people in that sense. So you can mark it as, let's say, a low priority. And that gives you, um, well, that helps you organize your time better, because we all have 24 hours in a day and we have limited time to contribute to open source projects.
Okay, so another question is, I'm genuinely interested in contributing to open source, but I find it overwhelming to understand large code bases and the overall structure of these projects. For someone who wants to make meaningful contributions, how do you recommend getting started and navigating that initial complexity?
Sure. Okay. So I think the best way to do this is to start using that piece of open source software first. And why I say this is because, well, it gives you this sense of, let's say, if you were to have, let's say, if, for example, let's say NumPy. So it's an array library in Python. And if you were to want to contribute to NumPy, then you would want to know where you want to contribute. So you would not want to know how to use NumPy before you want to start writing code for it. So for example, some bugs are, let's say, there are some bugs that you could find out while using NumPy. There are issues that you could find out that you could highlight on GitHub. Those are the things that usually help. That helps you isolate, let's say, where the problem is. Whether it's in your code or it's inside, let's say, NumPy. That gives you, that also gives you this, like, because if you're using NumPy for your projects, then also you also have an interest in basically, well, getting to contribute to it. So it's not like you're contributing to NumPy for the sake of it. So I hope that makes sense. Starting out small, starting out with, let's say, easier issues like documentation, fixing broken things inside the documentation. Navigating large code bases is only necessarily required when you have a very large piece of code that you want to write, and this is not surely not going to happen when you are starting out. So try to isolate the issue to a few files. um, Use the software that you want to contribute to first. That gives you this interest to um, basically contribute to it and give back because you're using that software.
Okay, so another question is, can you please give tips to find out good projects with good first issues for freshers?
Sure. Okay. So I would say that it depends upon your skill set. It's a blanket question that has various answers based on various aspects of your programming expertise. But the idea is that, let's say, if you're working on, let's say, a JavaScript related project, and or let's say Vue.js or some other project like Node.js or something like that, then it makes sense that if you're using that software, then you would know um, methods to get into it. Also, like, for example, contributing to the software that you use daily, or let's say finding out projects on GitHub. There's also websites which provide you with good first issues to work out with, and there are, let's say, a lot of good first issues in popular projects. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go and check those out because usually they are, I won't say they're necessarily easy for newcomers because they're easy for newcomers to open source. They're not easy for newcomers to programming in general.
Okay, so we have another question. What skills beyond coding like communication, design, thinking, or documentation help contributors get invited into high-level open source discussions?
Sure. Okay. So yes, communication is a big part of it. If the project that you want to contribute to has, let's say, community meetings, if they have meetings for newcomers, if they have meetings for experienced people, for triagers, for let's say people working in documentation, then you should join those meetings. You should go there, establish connections, grow your network. You should do that. The other thing is that design thinking also comes when you write more code. So, for example, to be a part of architectural discussions in a code, this is you have to contribute to that code and especially have an understanding of the code first. So, if you don't have an understanding of the code that you are contributing to, it is difficult to, let's say, understand things from uh, a deeper level. So you can understand the architecture uh, for a code base from a higher level, but you have to contribute code to be able to get into more deeper discussions. I hope that helps.
Okay, so we have another question. As recently, GitHub Copilot shifted from closed source to open source, but even though the code is visible, it's not free to use. So, would it be mentioned as open source or source available?
Um, I think there's a bit of nuance to this because GitHub's Copilot is also constituted by various pieces of open source software. So, for example, the code completions that GitHub's Copilot offers, they're available as an extension for Visual Studio Code, for example, for your IDEs, for your text editors, and those are open source. I can't say the same thing about models. So, it's not necessarily source available versus open source. It's asking you to pay, yes, but the source is it's not source available in the sense that it's not restricting you from, let's say, distributing that code as a different package or something. It's not restricting you from um, like sharing the code. It's not restricting you from studying the code and auditing it. It just requires an API key or your GitHub account to be able to use it, and of course, a paid subscription. So a lot of open source projects work on that model, and that's completely open source.
As a fresher participating in GSOC, how can I select the right open source organization to contribute to, and how do I find suitable issues or areas where I can start contributing?
Sure. So I think this also has a similar answer to the previous question. You should find out pieces of open source software that you use a lot. So if you use a piece of open source software, then it it's more enticing for you to contribute to it. And if they don't participate in let's say the Google Summer of Code program, that's all right. You can go to the Google open source those the GSOC page, and you should be able to filter out projects. You should do this by your skill set, and ideally you should do this early. So maybe you should do this by November, December. Projects are not announced until early February, but you can usually gauge which projects are have a higher chance of selection. I wouldn't say that the Google Summer of Code program is not the end goal. I appreciate the question, but the idea is that you should be contributing to open source outside of purely voluntarily. If you can, if you have the privilege to, then you should. But at least for this, for the scope of Google Summer of Code, find out projects that are not too hard for you. So don't select projects that have a steep learning curve. So you'll find out projects that have technology stacks that you're already familiar with in some parts. So, for example, you would not expect that as someone who has, let's say, if you don't have any experience in TypeScript, for example, then you would not expect that you would be able to learn TypeScript enough for um, big TypeScript projects. You could do that. I mean, it depends on how fast you can learn and pick up a new language, or let's say if a project requires knowledge of virtual machines. So that's something that you read about in your operating systems classes, but is usually theoretical. You have to kind of already be writing virtual machines, or at least exploring the code parts of them before you're able to contribute.
Do you think relying on closed AI or APIs weakens the open source ecosystem in the long run, even if the code itself is open?
It does, yes. So the reason is that basically you are like there are multiple ways where this can happen. So for example, right now most of the popular models that we have in the open source world are not open source, they're open weights. And if they're open weights, even then they are placed behind these barriers. So for example, Google's Gemini model is you require a Google account to use it. I mean, you can use some of the models locally. You can run them if you want to, but at the same time, to be able to access all of the features and integrate them with, let's say, Google's products, you still need a Google account. And what this does is that you have no privacy protection. So especially if you don't have an enterprise account, so you have no privacy protection if you share any code with a closed source language model, uh, like a even if it's an open source model, if the framework and let's say the stack built around using the model is not open source, and it will usually not be the case. So that means you're sharing data with third parties, and that would mean that they can use your code. They um, well, this is why there have been regulations in the arena for restricting this, but in the US especially, but they are trying to they can basically use your code for their training data to make it better, and no one is currently restricting them because it's quite a new field. No one has uh, the right policy frameworks to uh, prevent that kind of problem. So I hope that sort of answers it. It does also come back to open source. For example, let's say um, people use closed source open or closed source models to contribute to open source, and usually there is a bit of what is termed as AI slop when you contribute to PRs which make no head or tail.
So we have another question. Let me read that out. What are some sustainable alternatives for open source projects to avoid lock-in with closed AI or APIs?
I would have to think about it because I don't necessarily use open source AI projects a lot for at least my code. But I think your best bet would be something like Olama that allows you to download weights for models. I mean, they are still open weights models, but at least you can uh, run inference based on those models locally. So you're not sharing your data with third parties.
Okay, so if anybody have any other questions which are left, they can ask here only. They can unmute your mic. Please, anyone, if you have any questions, you can unmute your mic and ask it right here. I think somebody is raised hand. Please, Karthik, you can continue.
Hi, Samrai. Basically, I want to ask that I want to contribute the open source, but most project feels like too big or a complex. I'm not sure about how to start, what files to look, and how to pick my first issue. As we know, we are a fresher. So how should a fresher can do a good open source contribution accordingly. Yeah.
Okay, so there are two things at play here. So one is that as someone who is, let's say, if you're in your first year, you are basically going through your programming fundamentals. You're going through introductory courses in programming, and the difference here is that you are not only a newcomer to open source, but also to programming in general. If you haven't like programmed before, if you haven't written code before, so there's a difference between this. So, like for example, there are projects which welcome new contributors and newcomers to open source, but newcomers to open source does not translate to newcomers to programming in general. And that is something where you can uh, the second point here is that this is where you can contribute to small wins. So the idea is that maintainers are already burdened by, let's say, hundreds of issues for them, hundreds of PRs to review, lots of they have a lot of work to do, and we all have 24 hours right now. So um, you can contribute using small wins. So for example, fixing docs, writing more docs, writing tutorials, stuff that's easy to grab. That's one way to go about it. So that helps you like um, get into the project more, explore the project more, find out which files to look at. Most of the files would be either in restructured text or in Markdown. Stuff like that helps. Besides that, a bunch of files, you would know that a lot of files are not necessarily related to code. So for example, let's say if there are workflow files, so GitHub Actions files for running CI/CD services. If you're contributing to code, you don't necessarily need to touch them unless there's a problem there as well. So you can kind of use your magnifying glass and find out smaller files, smaller subsets of files to isolate bugs or isolate fixes.
Thank you, Ankit. Actually, we have got some questions through Google Form. Let me read them out to you. Where can I find like-minded people or online communities that can help me get started with open source contributions?
Sure. Okay. So I think there would be two or three answers to this. So one is to attend community meetings for projects, as I previously mentioned in one of the answers. So let's say, for example, NumPy has a newcomers meeting. So you can attend those meetings. You can join them. It's all on. You should be able to find that out on the numpy.org website. It's just for example. I am sure many other projects are doing the same thing. You can use those. You can attend various meetings and see what you like. There are meetings for regular developers as well if you want to get into those. Or let's say for the documentation team, the website team, the triagers team, and stuff like that. They these avenues could be helpful. The other thing is conferences and let's say meetups. So if you are from, let's say if you are from a metropolitan city, or if there's a metropolitan city close to you, then it might be a good idea for you to attend conferences. So for example, the biggest conference in India right now, at least for Python, that would be PyCon India. There, not only do you have a bunch of talks to learn from, but there's an entire day for you to um, that is restricted for, let's say, workshops or sprints. And what are sprints? Sprints are basically small scale meetups for maintainers of open source projects to bring their projects, and then they are available for you to mentor, and they're happy to mentor you for contributing to open source. They usually open lots of new good first issues for you to take up. You can use those for learning. And if you are at the conference, if you are at the sprint, then they can sit side by side. You can have a one-on-one conversation with them. So that might be a good idea. Usually conferences have student discounts and student prices. So they are usually made affordable for students. So I think these are two ways. Um, I also know that Pandas also has their newcomers meetings from time to time, and they have a Slack workspace. So if you're on Slack, you can create an account for their workspace and then attend those meetings. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. There's another question for you. You have worked on really complex things like Pyodide and compilers. How do you approach understanding such big and technically difficult code bases?
Okay, sure. Yes, I think that's interesting. I would say that it is not about approaching big code bases. At one point, you stop being scared about code bases because you know that you don't have to go through the entire code base to isolate a bug and create a fix for it. So the idea is that, for example, let's say there's a bug in Pyodide's, let's say, build system, for example, the part where it builds Pyodide and let's say builds all of the distributions and let's say all the executable files for Pyodide, that has to be controlled by the file that exists in the repository's root called the makefile. So you can use that as a starting point. So you would know that, let's say, if there's no issue in the Pyodide runtime, then I don't have to look at the JS code or the C code. I can simply look at the makefile and try to isolate the bug from there, and then go on and find out other other files that might be affected by that bug. So that is usually what helps. I don't necessarily contribute to the compilation side of Pyodide, but I do it more um, on the interoperability side of Pyodide. So ensuring that the packages that you use for Pyodide inside the browser, for example, NumPy or Matplotlib or let's say SciPy, all of those are supported well. So that does involve contributing to the runtime a bit sometimes.
Thank you. So, one thing is, how do you keep yourself updated when the tech world is changing so fast all the time?
Okay, I think that's slightly a loaded question because the tech world is not necessarily changing all the time. I mean, yes, there are a bunch of new developments every day, and it is difficult to keep up with them. But one thing that you could do is to pick a niche. So, for example, I like discussing things related to technology policy and also AI policy. Um, I usually stick to those areas because you cannot be a master of all trades. You have to pick one. You can learn a lot of things about. You can be a jack of all trades, but you have to be a master of one. So I think that would be helpful. Other than that, yes, new compilers, new tool chains, new software, new projects, all of them keep coming up. But usually, what happens is that if you have contributed to an open source project before, or if you have used a project before, usually your skills can be transferred very directly. All of the code that you write is still going to be the same. It's not like new languages erupt every day. So there are things that stand on the shoulders of giants, such as these languages, and you don't necessarily need to keep learning new things every day. So maybe just it makes sense to read the rubrics, keep your fundamentals correct, and that will be helpful for basically contributing to any new initiative or any new project.
Thank you. This was really helpful. Uh, we have another question. What inspired you to get into open source and scientific computing in the first place? What keeps you motivated even now?
So there are, so for the first question, I think what inspired me was Hacktoberfest. So I started contributing during Hacktoberfest. That eventually led to me getting into the Google Summer of Code program. I didn't know about it at the time. I found it later in the year. I found out about the opportunity. I took it. I was privileged enough, and I was lucky enough to get it. I would say. So that was one thing. Besides that, we had a bunch of projects where we used open source scientific software already. We had to use it because of capstone projects that we had to do at college. Usually those helped. So, for example, that's where I learned how to use NumPy or Pandas, for example. That helps. So using open source software eventually can help you, like it can lead to you contributing to those software as well.
Thank you, Advir. I think we have one last question for you. Can you share a time when your open source contribution had an impact in the real world that genuinely surprised you?
Yeah, I'll have to think about it because I would say that most of my work is on GitHub and it's all open source. Every PR that I make, it essentially impacts or benefits and someone else. So I don't think there is a PR that I can choose or any contribution that I can choose. But um, anything that you can do, I would say that I have contributed to a bunch of small wins as well, because that's usually what helps. So taking off the weight of someone else's shoulders is could be considered impactful. So I don't have one particular example in my head right now. There could be many.
So if anybody have any other questions or if their question is left by chance, they can ask it here live. I guess nobody has any questions. Okay, so I have one question. Actually, I have prepared two questions for you. So let me ask from them. You have got a question. Wait.
Oh, actually, by the way, there are a few questions in the Q&A tab.
Yeah, we have covered most of them. Few are left.
Sure. Okay.
With tools like Jupyter-Lite, do you think browser-based coding can really replace traditional tools in scientific computing someday?
I would say no, because browser-based coding is still restricted to browsers. For example, right now, one of the limitations for Pyoride is that there are no threads or subprocesses. So if you wanted to run code as a part of multiple threads, so there's no multiprocessing either. So it's going to be restricted to one thread because of, let's say, browser limitations, security, the inherent security model scientific software or library that you would like to share with others, it can be used as that platform. So it's like you can use it for creating low code apps as well. You can use it for dashboards. You can use it for uh, data science on small data. So not on big data because of the computational restrictions that you have inside the browser and the memory restrictions.
So one more question. I saw you have a Mastodon account. Do you think creating a fully open source decentralized network is actually possible that one can support AI or collaborative work?
Okay, I think I understand the first part of the question. Not, I don't understand the part about supporting AI or collaborative work. So maybe, like, if you're there, Dharun, you could elaborate on that part.
Hey Darren, I would request you to please read out your questions and explain it about more in detail. Harun Kumar.
Hi.
Hi, Dharun.
Um, do you think it's possible to create a open source decentralized network?
Yes, I mean, open source decentralized networks exist already. So, like, Mastodon is fully open
Yeah.
source. I mean, you can still restrict the servers that are on it, but you can also self-host Mastodon, and you can host your own instance if you wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have another question. open source contributors in India are defining it. As a person experienced in open source, what are your thoughts on it? Also, is there any solution to it?
Okay, so yes, I think that is a relatively new phenomenon. I don't think it used to happen, let's say, 10 years ago or something. Usually it's happening much more, let's say, after the COVID pandemic. So I think the solution to it is more government intervention. I'm not sure if that's the best solution. It's just my opinion. I think that the government can definitely capitalize on this thing. They do have a bunch of new initiatives in open source, and they are using open source for their own projects. But I think there is a marketing gap in the sense that the government doesn't know how to market their efforts. And I think if they do that, we don't necessarily need to like there's a lot of opportunities that can be made that can be created for open source contributing to open source code. It's not only about writing new open source code, but also about making previous closed source code open. So for example, the legacy systems that still power old government websites of today. So there are a bunch of new opportunities that can be created, but it's a policy problem. So I would say that there is much more nuance to it rather than just loads of people contributing to open source. So yes, given the fact that India has a large population, the essence, the spirit of open source, which is collaboration over competition, that does take a backseat.
Thank you. Thank you again. Actually, I have a question of mine.
Sure.
How important is non-code contribution like documentation, community management, and policy in open source ecosystems? And they do really help in career perspectives. Let's say I
Yes.
want to start an open source contribution. If I start with documentation, is it really helpful?
It is, and for the first part, it is as important as code contributions. So there is a tendency for people to undermine those contributions, as let's say, for example, saying that code contributions are much more effective or much more, they establish you much more in the community, but that's not the case. Documentation is as important as writing new code. Because if you write new code and you haven't documented it, no one knows about it, because not everyone is going to read through the code. And if you document it properly, then that makes your users happy. So that is something that more projects should well emphasize on. They should do that. I would say it's as important for career for perspectives in careers. Yes. um, let's say contributing to open source software and as a part of non-code contributions, even if it's, let's say, design, if it's writing more documentation, there are a bunch of career opportunities. So there is, you can be a designer in the open source world. You can design open source software. For example, if you have web apps and they are open source, then if you have already contributed to open source projects as a part of their design work, that helps. If you're already, let's say, if you've written a lot of documentation, blog posts, technical documentation, stuff like that, then that can help you snag one of those good um, technical writing opportunities.
Thank you so much for answering it. So for today, we have come to end with today's Tech Talk, the open source icebergs, licenses, livelihoods, and leadership. A heartfelt thank you to you, Agriya Khetarpal, for taking the time to share us such insightful details and knowledge about the real world perspectives, which we were unknown of, definitely. It was truly enriching to hear about your experiences and about your hidden layers of open source. I'm sure everyone here is walking away with a deeper understanding of fresher ideas. So thank you to all the attendees as well. Your presence and engagement made this session really interactive and fun to each and every one of us. We hope this is just the beginning of more such conversation, and we're going to have much more in the future as well. So thank you everyone, and have a great evening ahead.
Thanks all. Thanks for taking the time to join this call.
Thank you.
And yeah, please feel to connect with me anywhere if you want to. And yeah, it was great talking to you all.